Welcome to Institutional Design, Vehicles of Reparation and Repatriation. So the context of our conversation is the second in a series. And just to frame the conversation, there's a quote from Michael Manley: politics is not talk, it's action. But we need the kinds of institutions that will take us to where we want to go. Otherwise, it's just rhetoric. And so he introduced the idea of institutional design, taking us where we want to go. And so this concept of vehicles of reparation and vehicles of repatriation, aspirations of Black people in the diaspora. Reparations has morphed from just being commonly understood as demands for payment to the concept of repair. Damage was done, and that damage needs to be repaired. And whether or not payments are ever made, somebody must pay to repair, whether it's self-repair, whether it's those institutions, ecclesiastical institutions that have begun to register their guilt and responsibility with regards to repairing the damage of slavery because they participated. There are a number of such denominations that have been leading the way, while governments, the British government particularly, has been trying to evade and avoid the issue. But now the notion is on repair. How do we repair the damage done from slavery? And recognition that it's not up to someone else. It begins with self. Also, repatriation has taken on a particular meaning, cultural repatriation, whether or not one returns to actually one's fatherland. The culture and the identity that was lost is in fact that which one needs to return to. And so the Sankofa issue of wherever one is geographically in one's world, one needs to culturally repatriate and return to the identity, etc. Within those two augmented definitions of repatriation and reparation, we're talking about, well, how do Black people get there? How do we get to those places? What vehicles, what kinds of institutions? And so this conversation particularly started off looking at the institutions in religion and in education, and focused, in fact, on those institutions that were indigenous to those who were enslaved, how they managed to resist the agenda of perpetual exploitation and robbery of self, reconnecting with their ancestral cosmology and with their ancestral identity and ways. That was one of the first ways of resistance. And as we know in case of Haiti, it is through these means, through these rituals, that the resistance, the political struggle, was fed and was kept strong. There was a particular term that you used, which was very striking, Professor Hutton, in the last conversation. Rituals of repossession, you call them. Rituals of repossession, which allowed the enslaved, when the master wasn't looking, to reassert African identity and ancestral connections, and to nurture the soul that was robbed. So just taking up here, Professor Hutton, do you want to elaborate?
I raised about rituals of repossession. That one of the things that was common to Africans under enslavement. was that they created rituals to repossess themselves. And these rituals were done in the night, in sacred spaces that they framed. Repossession is used because Africans were possessed, owned by the enslavers. And repossession rituals, and these were described in various literatures and handed down, and they still continue to this day in voodoo, in Mayal revival in Jamaica, in what was called Shango, now Orisha, in Trinidad. In Cuba, we have Santeria, or what the Cubans call Lukame, which is a tradition out of Nigeria. And there is also a tradition out of the Congo that they call Palo. And Palo in Cuba is called Mayombe. You have Comfort in Guyana. You have Candomblé and other such practices in Brazil. And of course, you have in the Eastern Caribbean, including Trinidad, you have what is called spiritual Baptists. These are institutions founded by enslaved Africans, and they were created out of their African experiences on the continent. And they did that within the Caribbean under different contexts. Repossession rituals were forms of therapy. Having been treated with such unspeakable brutality, like being forced to consume human excrement by various types of amputations, arms, legs, genital amputations, being forced to eat food that was really not good. For example, sick animals that died on the estates were not thrown away. They were converted as food for the enslaved population. And so, in order to live within that context, in order to survive, in order to resist, they performed these rituals of repossession. These rituals took various forms, but they were quite similar. It's a use of artistic expressions for invocations, music, dance, various forms of scatting, groaning, various forms of ritual writing. One name for such is veve. But these were all common to all of these practices across the Caribbean, which also used alcoholic beverages, different forms of food. And the combination of all of these was to induce possession. The idea is being possessed by African gods and African ancestors. The sum total of these endeavors was to reach the point of being possessed by African spirits. That possession is a form of therapy, because the possession means that the person who is possessed became the spirit that possessed that person. So a man like the case in Westmoreland, who was forced to eat human excrement, at the point of doing that, it's a form of real desecration of the black body, spirit and soul. But the possession ritual enabled him to be possessed by an ancestor God, and therefore, in that period of possession, that person cleansed himself by becoming an African god, could be Legba or Oshun, any other form, or by African ancestral spirits. So possession ritual across the Caribbean was extremely important in their resistance culture. I have done studies of African insurrections against slavery throughout the Caribbean. And like the Asian Revolution, which began with 2 ritual feasts, it is really linking, converting with, communion with the ancestors to go into war with them. So the Asian Revolution began with 2 such rituals. And even after slavery, in Jamaica, the Morant Bay Uprising, led by Paul Bogle, began the day before, the night before, with a tea meeting in Stony Gut. So these rituals are extremely important, and it's a result of that we can speak to the issue of repatriation. Because the cosmological roots of repatriation began in those rituals. When somebody dies and his spirit person was freed from the dead body, that spirit with the right kind of funeral and wake arrangements was able to repatriate to the ancestral homeland. And then is able to be summoned by the enslaved, by the living, through various forms of feeding rituals, feasting rituals, and libations, to come back and fight with them in their struggles for freedom. And so death, which releases the spirit, the person's spirit, is seen as the beginning, the cosmological roots of African diasporic freedom. So it is very important in our studies with our students, with the populations of the Caribbean and further afield, to develop this type of scholarship and to engage in these rituals of ancestry that will help us to understand where we are coming from and hence our journey forward.
The colonial project and this enslavement project and Christianity and Christian mission were never 2 separate agendas. In fact, in nowhere is this more pronounced than in that very celebrated letter that Columbus carried with him from Ferdinand and Isabella, where in the name of the Pope, greatest father of all, the intent to dominate and to take over, first in the name of Christ, secondly in the name of the great father, the Pope, and thirdly in the name of the king, to whom the Pope has ceded this authority given to him. So it was really a theological construct that enabled the enslavement project and that fueled, again, if you are talking about how theology bleeds over into other human endeavors, the entire colonial and slavery issue was not divorced. In fact, much more than not divorced, it was informed. One could say Christianity was the influence that produced the expansionist notion in Christianity of dominion, which they share with Islam, produced the enslavement project. So, Dr. Lewis, is that a fair idea? And what would you say further on that? Now that the church is basically the majority influence theologically, certainly in Jamaica, and seeking to reconcile past and present. I leave the football to you.
Well, thanks to both of you for inviting me to be part of this conversation. And in some ways, I think it's a continuation of a previous conversation that Clinton, Alice Berry, and others collaborated with me when I was president at the United Theological College in a barnyard experience. And this is our plug. The barnyard experience is in 4 parts, and it is actually on YouTube. But we talked about it, and we wanted to have a kind of immersion experience with the students around revivalism and African Caribbean worldviews. The occasion was the honoring of the late Reverend Dr. Hyacinth Booth, who was the first woman ordained by the Methodist Church in the Caribbean and the Americas. And it was, the point of departure was a sermon that she preached that started with a riddle. Riddle me this, riddle me that, guess me this riddle and perhaps not. What's more like church than church? And she gave the answer, the barnyard. So it was very interesting, and she had a well-reasoned rationale for saying that the barnyard was what, and all of the other Caribbean expressions and names for the same phenomenon was what was the closest religious experience to the early church in the Jamaican and the Caribbean context. So I start with that to say, first of all, the Christian church is not homogeneous. And the Christian church did not start with European Christianity. So we need to recognize that from the Hebrew Bible, the training of Moses, for example, took place in Egypt and Ethiopia. Right? So Moses was trained as a pharaoh with all of the magical arts. And then his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian or Ethiopia, was the person who taught him governance. And to say, you can't sit down there with everybody coming to you. You need some help. So divide up the work, get some more people, etc., etc. So that's the first thing I want to say. And then in the New Testament, in the Acts of the Apostles, we read of the Ethiopian finance minister. And I'm deliberately calling him the Ethiopian finance minister. He was the finance minister of the Candace, who would regularly travel from Ethiopia to Jerusalem on pilgrimage. So here is a Black man who is literate, who is powerful politically, and who is devout, right? Now, most people call him the Ethiopian eunuch, but my particular reason for calling him the Ethiopian finance minister is to say we need to stop defining Black men by their genitals only. Right? This is a finance minister. So I think if you put that kind of image against the popular image of Africans in the Western press, that's not what we're getting. A literate, very learned, devout finance minister, powerful man who is not only into money, but into his total development as a human being, including his spiritual development. So that's the first thing I want to say, that all of this rhetoric about Christianity is linked to the Western European branch of Christianity, but there's a whole other set of Christian traditions, Orthodox and Coptic traditions that we didn't know so much about in the Caribbean until the Ethiopian Orthodox came. So that's the first thing I want to say. Neither Christianity nor Islam are homogeneous. So while they do have these aggressive tendencies and people and sections that get nationalistic with some very weird mixtures of nationalism and conservative religion. That's not the whole story of Christianity. That's the first thing. But I think the discussion about reparation and repatriation and how institutions of religion and education can help to move us forward on the depth of meaning of these two words, I think it's really important. So I want to just make maybe 3 points. The first is to say that I did some research with the Asara Set Society. It was started by a Panamanian man, Shechem Rao Nefa, Amen. He was from Panama and actually a very accomplished musician. And he was the inspiration for developing, as far as I know, he's still alive, this religion, which is to a large extent based on ancient Egyptian concepts, but other concepts as well. And the idea that pieces of the African wealth, of the African spirituality and philosophical knowledge were spread across the world. And our task in this incarnation is to bring it back together. So it's based on the central myth is the myth of what the Westerners call Isis and Osiris, what they call Asar and Aset. So the idea is to bring it back together. Now, I find it interesting that as I was hosted by the Asarians and they shared some of their wisdom with me, that they speak of possession in a way that's interesting, thinking of Clinton's idea. So for them, we would normally hear when people go in trance in revival church or Pentecostal church, that the spirit possesses them. And the Western understanding, if it was an African ritual, was that this was demonic possession, right? But the Asarians say they possess the deity because our real identity is God or Amen. And they have a central practice, the Tree of Life ritual, where the adherents study and use rituals to incorporate the qualities of each deity. So they have an 11 deity mandala, and it starts with Geb, that's the body. I won't go into all of it, but you kind of go through the cycles of trying to develop the qualities of God embodied in each deity. So I think most people would have heard of like Ma'at. Ma'at is one of them, or Set, So this involves rituals similar to revival in that there is art, particular perfumes, plants, and other objects, fruits associated with each deity, specific music and dance, but also mental qualities, that you do. And the idea is, they said, no, we are not possessed by the deity. We possess the deity when we go into trance, and this, you're making your way up the Tree of Life, possessing the qualities one by one through the cycles to eventually get to the stage of Amen. So I wanted to share that with you and to say one of my interests is in interfaith and multi-faith conversations. And what I have found is that in the Western world to which we are related, the multi-faith conversations usually are around the so-called world religions. But the African religions, it's not always easy to, it's not always the thing to have those discussions. And certainly from a personal point of view, I found because of all of the atrocities done by Western people in the name of Christianity, that sometimes it is difficult to say, okay, Christians, Muslims, traditional religion, revival, Rasta, let's come together and have a project about, you know, all of Africans. It's difficult. And part of that, I think, is the repair which we need to do with respect to the trauma, the intergenerational trauma, so graphically described by Clinton, and there's lots more. We had Mr. Thistlewood's diaries in very graphic detail as to some of those atrocities. And how do we incorporate in our way forward in our institutions systems of healing? Now, there is an African-American psychotherapist, Joy DeGruy, who speaks of post-traumatic slave syndrome. And part of that has to do with the internalization of some of the things we use to cope with these atrocities that were probably more dysfunctional. And then that has become translated as African culture. You know what I'm saying? So she has unmasked some of this in her theory of post-traumatic slave syndrome, both in terms of how the Black population in the United States has responded to intergenerational trauma, but also the way in which the atrocities desensitized the white population to the humanity of Black people, and that this still continues. So one of the pictures she uses in her book and in her lectures is a picture of the hanging, the lynching of a Black man. And the people watching the lynching include families, obviously coming from church, children in their Sunday best with their parents, watching the lynching of a Black man after church as entertainment. And then they would also afterwards do some dismemberment and people would have souvenirs, a finger or whatever. So she's saying, when the ancestors of this generation of white Americans from childhood are trained to see the lynching of a Black man as entertainment, juxtaposed to coming from church, then something has happened intergenerationally there too, which results in desensitization. I'm currently trying to finish up an article for publication on the religious education syllabus in Jamaica. The CXC was set up, if you can remember, way back when, as a decolonization process. Caribbean syllabi would reflect the Caribbean experience, would be validated by the very good scholars that we have, and would be about, would be relevant to the students who are taking them. Now, there were a number of folks in Jamaica, Christian leaders actually, one of whom was Reverend Ashley Smith, and they launched quite a vigorous campaign for a religious education syllabus, which would include not only the so-called major world religions, as is the case in places like England and other places that do religious education, but would also include African Caribbean religions. So the idea is that it would be a phenomenological approach that ultimately was aimed at knowledge and peace and respect. So you would learn the beliefs and practices of the various religions as a phenomenon, compare the beliefs and practices, compare ethical stances on all kinds of things like abortion, marriage, and the whole religious education thing globally, not just for the Caribbean, is to say religion has stuff that can be useful. It's a very powerful force. Last statistics I saw, about 85% of the world's population believe in some kind of religious or spiritual framework. And that we wanted to know the truth, to know about the religions and not just to have knee-jerk reactions to what comes, to understand people and to be able to build communities with religious diversity that can live in peace. It was going very well. And Jamaica, if I recall, had the largest number of students offering for that. You could do options of Christianity majors with the so-called world religions, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism. But I think everybody had to do the Caribbean religions, your spiritual Baptist, Voodoo, and so forth. I taught that syllabus part-time. I am convinced it was a good syllabus, talking about institutions, because this was a place now where high school students are being taught Caribbean religions on par with the major world religions and being taught to respect, even if that's not their religious belief, but to have respect for other religions and to be able to live with people from different religions. Now it's been decimated. Religious education specialists in the teachers' colleges have been deployed to other places, and many high schools are just not offering it. Why? A big part of the answer was that it wasn't seen as something that could earn people money. The sense I'm getting from those conversations, and it does not only relate to religious education, but the arts, anything that's not STEM and business has been coming under pressure for budgets and so on in education systems in many places, right? So I have seen budget cut for music education in some places. You don't need to do history. You don't need to do anything that's not STEM or business. Can this earn you a living? If it can't earn you a living, it's irrelevant and in some cases even ridiculed. No. If you read John Mbiti's book on African religions, part of what he said is that Africans are notoriously religious. So apart from cutting this syllabus, which was supposed to have been, in my view, an advance from just religious education, because in the early days, the schools that were set up by the churches were doing Christian religious education, usually Bible knowledge or something like that it was called, skewed largely to the perspective of the religion, the denomination that owned the church. But some of these church people, like Ashley Smith, who were post-colonial theologians, were saying, no, we need to look at all the religions in the Caribbean and honor the African religions, understand them, decolonize decolonize our thinking about it. I think there are a lot of conversations for us to have about spirituality and about philosophy and what African worldviews and maybe even some of our historical worldviews have to offer. Yes. Certainly, from my reading of Marcus Garvey, it was an integrated human being that was being pushed by the UNIA. You had people of different religions, not only Christians, but you did have the African Orthodox Church. You had health with the Black Cross nurses and so on. They were listening to classical music. They were learning African history and being taught dignity. You had political organization in the UNIA, which included women at top levels long before the kind of major feminist wave in the Caribbean. And a well-organized structure in terms of what was to happen. That was holistic development. And I would even say there was one that happened just before independence. There was I think under Norman Manley, where they had better village campaigns and so on. There was a big community development push that I think was sponsored by the Cess on the Bananas, right? But the idea, again, was holistic development that took in physical, psychological, cultural, and economic development and community, better village campaigns and things like that. But we came to a place, I humbly submit, since the 1980s, and more obviously since the fall of the Soviet Union, where it seems that human development is constricted only to utility, not to an integration of development, which includes artistic, cultural, spiritual, physical, psychological, as well as intellectual. That whole movement seems to have gone. And the specialists who were trained in the teachers' colleges have by and large been deployed to other areas, and the religious education departments dismantled. And the evidence I've been trying hard to get the statistics, but the anecdotal evidence I have is that even some of the high schools that used to offer that have stopped offering it. So you have much fewer students now who are sitting in a class and talking about religion, including the African religions in the Caribbean.
Thanks for that, because you've anticipated where we want to take the conversation, and you skillfully avoided my attempt to divide the argument into Africa versus Europe and Christianity versus African retentions, and made the very pragmatic point that whatever the truth about the church, the fact is that it is the dominant influence now. And I don't think we have the option of everybody converting to Orthodox or some Coptic version of Christianity. And it is a kind of creativity that will allow us, the church, to reconcile itself with its past and its collusion with the forces of colonialism. And,
well, let me say something. I wasn't avoiding it, but there was so much already about revivalism that I wanted to open it up a little bit about, apart from that. That's one aspect. The institutional church is the obvious belief layer. But I've been part of this transatlantic theological writing project with folks from Ghana, a few from Nigeria, and from Jamaica, both in the countries and in the diaspora. One of the interesting things that came up in some of those conversations is that a colleague in Ghana was saying, oh, but his mother, who was Anglican or something, but traditional church, would go in the morning to the European church, and in the evening, she putting on her ritual clothes and going to the equivalent, they would call it African Independent Church in Ghana. And then we had somebody from Jamaica who was saying their thing, I think it was Monday evening, was the revival time. So they would go to the traditional church in the morning, but at night, as Clinton said, they would be going to the revival church. So I'm just saying that there is an official rhetoric about maybe even the hegemony of the mainline churches.
Mm-hmm.
But that is not the whole story.
Yes.
People, I would call it even a part of, we were talking about the Maroons, as I told you, and I was saying, it's kind of like a camouflage that you learn. You have to
Right.
do what you have to do, but it does not mean because you don't say it or because you don't obviously acknowledge it that your DNA is not African and you are
Yes.
not engaging the African in the night and in the private spaces in the home.
Yes.
Okay.
I think you misunderstood me. When I said that you avoided, it was far from an accusation. It was in admiration because it was a trap in the sense that people do tend to kind of be, one
Oh
side or
no.
the other. And the fact of our existence requires that we become creative and integrative in our thinking about our present and our past, which is
Mm-hmm.
what you've been bringing to the table.
And I would
And
say, as a Christian,
yes.
incarnation is key. Jesus was a Jew. He was never anything else.
Mm-hmm.
He was a Jew
Mm-hmm.
and raised in that culture. So there are Christian theologians, Black theologians, liberation theologians, Caribbean theologians, African theologians, womanist theologians. I call myself a non-ish theologian, who are reclaiming, number one, the African presence in the Bible, because there's more reference to Africa than Europe in the Bible, many more. Can't remember the exact number. Garvey did that too. If you look at Garvey's Catechism, it's a fabulous document. So we did not give up agency even during enslavement.
Mm-hmm.
So the agency to me came in the ways Clinton mentioned about repossessing yourself as kings and queens.
Yes.
And I find it interesting that Beyonce had a whole big show. And I remember Clinton talking about that very often in those, after the brutalization, those possession rituals. People were kings and queens and, somebody. And that's a trope that still seems to continue in the diaspora when we are saying who we are, you know? So we have
Yeah.
agency, and that
Yes.
agency included Sam Sharp and the other people who could say, no, you can't serve two masters. So it is my Christian duty to oppose enslavement.
You've already anticipated how the barnyard can be converted into the schoolroom, in that the kinds of creative approaches which I thought was very not just innovative but powerful, equating the barnyard with early Christianity. That kind of an approach which will allow one to integrate the various sources of learning without necessarily having to come upon some kind of cognitive dissonance because you are challenging the very premises of your epistemology or your orientation, your theological persuasions. That point of the shaping of curriculum intentionally to promote the aims of the new nation that we have become. And the neglect of that, which is obviously a mistake, and it also is hand in glove with the related but separate issue of the much spoken about values and attitudes in schools. And for the very same reasons you mentioned, that people are thinking that school is for just one thing, making money, and it's a values deficit that we have. So there are further conversations that will certainly deepen the breadth that we have covered in this conversation. I'm actually very thankful for all that has been said. In fact, one of those conversations very quickly is also the light that a proper investigation of African sources of theology that might allow us not only to discover more insights on African religion, but on all religion. You mentioned Mbiti and his deep insights into African Christianity and African theology, which might allow us ways of beginning to approach the kinds of narrow-minded fundamentalism, which does not allow for the kind of introspection which will reconcile the past colonial impact of Christianity and on the present moment. So thanks. I'm very thankful, as I said, Dr. Lewis. And Professor Hudson, do you have any final words?
I have a lot to say. I'm glad that Marjorie is writing that piece on the issue of religion and spirituality in the curriculum in our schools or in CXC. She mentioned about the community efforts by Norman Manley, which was actually managed and led by Tom Gervin.
Right.
Who's
Jamaica
Norman
Welfare.
Gervin's, yeah, it was Norman Gervin's dad.
Yeah.
But just to be forceful, if you will, and stark about what they are trying, the desecration and the devaluation of the role of spirituality, of the role of culture, because at the heart of Caribbean culture is Caribbean spirituality, right? So mambo music, which Cuba gave to the world, emerged out of Santeria and Mayombe, including the immediate agency of that music. So it is with ska, rocksteady, reggae. Pan music was created out of the Orisha Palais of Trinidad and given to the world. Pan as an instrument and pan as an artistic and aesthetic expression came out of that. Right? So if we are the way to teach about Caribbean spirituality and about Caribbean religion and to favor one over the other is totally wrong. Just ask ourselves, what does Bob Marley mean to the Jamaican economy? They're talking about you can't make money from this and reducing the human beings to money. What does Marley mean to Jamaican culture, to the Jamaican economy? We can ask the same thing about Lee Scratch Perry. We can ask the same thing about a whole pantheon of these people in the different forms of our musical expression. We're talking about making money. Why do tourists come to Jamaica? The Jamaican cultural expression is subsidizing the tourist industry in Jamaica. Even though we have people who now hold their noses and say, no, we mustn't teach these things. Right? So the same thing with Caribbean art. Our leading painters like Leroy Clark from Trinidad, Manuel Mendive from Cuba, Philip Moore from Guyana, is rooted in this culture. So if we want to study aesthetics in Caribbean creativity, we have to go by that route. We can't look for something from Europe. And it is there and done already. We have influenced the globe culturally and in specific forms. Ask ourselves, what are the sources of these forms of creativity? What are the sources of Jamaican and Caribbean visual artistic expression, of Jamaican dramatic traditions and Caribbean dramatic tradition? Luckily, many of our novelists have linked into that tradition to write some of the most beautiful novels we have in the world, which include in their writings the novel as a source of Caribbean philosophy, right? So I think the people who have the type of authority to denigrate and to subordinate their own sense of self in favor of those who were for centuries. That's a legacy. That's a legacy of greed. That's a legacy of the desecration of the Black body that we are perpetuating today. Right? The Caribbean is nothing internationally without its culture. That's what people have linked into. And to reduce somebody, which is not true, the idea is really not true, but to reduce somebody to merely making money, and therefore you do the subjects that make money, is foolishness. Some of our best researchers in medical science became the best because they linked to folk medicine. They were able to research the plants, the pharmaceutical industry, all of these things. So we are really still stifled. We are still stifled by the Eurocentric episteme, which tell us ontologically we are nothing. And we are only something or somebody if we are able to ape the European ways of existence. We must resolutely fight this thing. We must not give a quarter to this thing. We are 62 years of independence. We have had 468 years of colonial subjection, in which 330 of those years were years of enslavement. So what I'm saying is not easy. I understand the basis of this type of deformation. I understand it. But we have to fight it because we have had a history of anti-colonial resistance, and we are actually, in a sense, subverting the expression of these in our scholarship or in certain institutions that should know better. Because you know what? Some people in their narrowness benefit from these things.
Of course.
They benefited from it, and therefore they want to continue to suppress it. We must not give a quarter